Hi, it's Brett, and this is Brett and Some Books. Today we are continuing Who Ate the First Oyster by Cody Cassidy. This chapter is called Who Told the First Joke We Know. If the time of our species on Earth were a day, this happened 19 minutes before midnight, or 4,000 years ago. On a November afternoon in 1872, in a corner of the British Museum, the Assyriologist George Smith was hunched over an ancient cuneiform tablet, slowly deciphering its symbols. The work was painstaking. Cuneiform has hundreds of symbols and no punctuation, and no more than two and more than 2,000 years of decay had worn the etchings down to almost nothing. Still, he read with a focused anticipation. The damaged tablet had hinted at a secret, and he could barely wait while the museum's restorer rendered it legible. Finally, as Smith's finger fell upon the final symbol, he gave a shout. He leapt from his chair, raced about the room, and, according to legend, began removing his clothes. After 10 years of searching, Smith had found his confirmation of the Old Testament's greatest tale. Smith had an unlikely education for someone regarded as the era's leading Assyriologist. At 14, he dropped out of school to begin work as a banknote engraver at the Bradbury and Evans publishing house, where he would have likely stayed had his office not been walking distance from the British Museum. Smith began to spend his lunch hour there, and his eye for etched detail drew him to the cuneiform tablets recovered from the ancient cities of Mesopotamia. Over lunches, he taught himself to read the script well enough that the museum hired him away from his publishing job, and he quickly became one of the world's best Assyriologists. In 1867, he discovered within the tablets a contemporary account of a solar eclipse and was able to identify it as one astronomers had calculated to have occurred over Mesopotamia on June 15th, 763 BC. It's one of the oldest specific days ever recorded. But as he continued to translate the ancient tablets, another obsession took hold. Smith began searching for first-hand confirmation of events described in the Old Testament, particularly Noah's flood. Such a catastrophic occurrence, he reasoned, would surely have been documented. 20 years after he began his search, Smith found what he had been looking for. On a tablet discovered by the Ottoman archaeologist Hormuzd Rassam and written long before the book of Genesis, Smith read of a great flood and of a man who saved the world's animals by building a giant boat, which is when Smith was compelled to rid himself of his clothing. The flood story is part of the Epic of Gilgamesh, a widely considered the oldest novel ever written. An anonymous Assyrian inscribed the flood story no later than 2,700 years ago, though there's no telling how long it lasted in oral form. The story is fiction, but its similarity to Noah's flood is not a coincidence. Many scholars believe it inspired the Bible's version. The Epic of Gilgamesh represents the final evolution of writing. For its first 1,000 years, writing in Mesopotamia had been the exclusive domain of accountants, serving largely to record debts and enforce taxes. The entire medium was the Mesopotamian equivalent of credit scores and tax forms, which raises scholars the question: how did such a rigid accounting system morph into one that was endlessly flexible and able to record the world's best known story 2,700 years ago? The answer might be a few scribbled school jokes. Jokes and humorous proverbs first appeared nearly 4,000 years ago when master scribes wrote ancient quips for their students to copy. The Assyriologist Jane Matushik tells me, both as a way for them to learn the then dead language of Sumerian and to impart morals like ancient versions of Aesop's fables. They began as simple sentences, but evolved into complex tales of morality. And while it's nearly impossible to know which joke or which proverb is the oldest, because dating the cuneiform can't be done with that level of precision, when I posed the question to Yale University professor of Assyriology Benjamin Foster, he nominated this 4,000-year-old one-liner, which he believed to be as good a candidate as any for the world's oldest joke. When the lion came to the sheepfold, the dog put on his best leash. It's profoundly unfunny, but since good jokes have a shelf life that is sometimes measured in days, this isn't a surprise. Whether it's funny today, however, isn't the point. The Akkadian creator received a chuckle for their prose, or at least they hoped to, according to Foster. Thanks to this joke and others like it, humanity's most creative invention turned from a boring accountant medium into something else entirely. Beginning with these early proverbs, writing became a way to communicate stories, information, and everything else the spoken word could conceivably conjure. Unfunny jokes marked the beginning of the medium's revolution from tax returns to comedy scripts and epic tales of ancient floods. So who was this jokester who just may have saved written communication? Let's call him Will, after one of the medium's greatest, Mr. Shakespeare, and to him because scholars note that the earliest proverbs are predominantly written from the male perspective, although female scribes certainly existed. Will was born 4,000 years ago in the ancient city of Nippur, located on what is now central Iraq, roughly 100 miles south of Baghdad. Nippur was founded some 7,000 years ago along the marshy banks of the Euphrates River and was one of the longest continually occupied cities in the world before it fell into decay sometime in the first millennium. By the time of Will's birth, the rivers had shifted, the once frequently flooded plains had largely dried, and the citizens of Nippur had ceased using reed for their houses and had transitioned to Mesopotamian staple of mud brick. Nippur was a religious capital with a central temple. Most of the 40,000 Sumerian clay tablets archaeologists have recovered from the city deal with the temple's administration, the salaries of officials, the taxation of the citizens, and the accounting of grain. But a few clearly originate from Nippur's scribal schools, where temple administrators taught young students Sumerian. One of the one of these early instructors was Will, which means he occupied a relatively lofty position in Akkadian society and might have come from a family of some means. Perhaps he was the son of a wealthy merchant. Akkadians were polytheists. They believed different gods controlled different and minute aspects of their daily life. If they had debts, they prayed to Utu to clear them. If they sought revenge, they would ask Ninurta for assistance. And if they bought a service from a shopkeeper, the shopkeeper might swear to Enki that the work would be done quickly. But Will himself may not have been terribly pious, according to Ben Ulster, who in his book Wisdom of Ancient Sumer wrote that the first proverbs display a completely secular attitude toward social behavior. The consensus among scholars is that Sumerian scribes, like Will, were the Akkadian versions of a Sunday Christian, men and women of negotiable religious conviction. As a young man, Will would have attended scribal school himself, an experience that appears to bear some remarkable similarities to the modern version of primary education. Children began at a similar age, had homework, took tests, and learned some of the same lessons, taught in some of the same ways. Grammar would have been simpler, as cuneiform has no punctuation. Although it would have been tedious nonetheless, Sumerian was by then a dead language, which according to Ulster accounts for a few spectacular mistakes. One student trying to copy the symbols for lame apparently carved the symbol for frog instead, which is not a mistake a native speaker would make. Sumerian was the modern day Latin of its time, existing only for the educated elite. Scholars believe scribal schools taught far more than bookkeeping, however. We'll also learn lessons on etiquette and morality and how to be a good Mesopotamian man or woman ought to behave. He did this largely through ancient oral proverbs intended to ridicule an archetypal fool and his vices or stupidity and thus teach better behavior. These old jokes and proverbs are part of what Matuzik tells me was an art of insulting, which developed in ancient Mesopotamia and existed orally for centuries before Will inscribed the phrases on tablets, using the same symbols but with new purpose and meaning. In time, of course, the new idea became common among the scribes, and many examples have since been recovered, such as the following Akkadian slams translated and passed on by Matusik. Intelligence of a monkey. The pigsty is her house, the oven is her reception room. Your husband has no clothes to wear, you yourself are wearing rags, your butt sticks out from them. Scribal school teachers told these humorous put-downs to elicit a chuckle, but also to impart lessons upon their students. As becomes clear, Matusik tells me, humor in Sumerian didactic literature isn't about telling jokes or funny anecdotes. The main aim is to educate students by presenting a protagonist who mocks and ridicules a fool, as in this example. May my field be small so I can go home soon. The modern interpretation of this joke might be, I hope I don't make too much income, that way I won't have to pay too much income tax. Will would have likely learned these proverbs and insults in an oral form while as a student, and he must have learned them well because he eventually advanced to scribal instructor, allowing him not just to follow lessons but to create them. His lesson and innovation was to put some of these insults and jokes into writing, perhaps to give his students a more interesting writing assignment than the endless documentation of barley shipments and business banalities they were used to. And the innovative joke he chose may have well been, when the lion came to the sheepfold, the dog put on his best leash. Here's why Will thought that was funny. The dog is saying, I used to be a guard dog, but now that I see this lion here, I'm switching back to a household pet. The humor is lost in the translation, but the bones of the joke are remarkably timeless. A modern retelling might include a lifeguard opting to take their lunch break as they see the fin cut through the water, or nearly the entire plot of Sergeant Bilko. The fact that the oldest joke in recorded history shares so much in common with modern forms of humor is not lost on psychologists. There appears to be a certain bedrock formula to humor written somewhere in the Homo sapiens brain, which has led many scholars, philosophers, comedians, and writers to pursue a universal explanation of laughter and humor. The Roman polymath Pliny the Elder believed that laughter resulted from a stimulation of a diaphragm that stretched just under the skin, which he thought explained why people laugh when tickled under the thin-skinned armpits, and, according to Pliny, why Roman gladiators died laughing when stabbed through the gut. More recently, psychologists have defined laughter broadly as the result of a sudden, pleasant mental shifts. As a practical matter, this is only slightly more explanatory than Pliny's diaphragm theory. So the methods jokes used to inspire these pleasant mental shifts are genuinely broken into three theories. The guard dog joke relies upon what scholars call the incongruity theory of humor. A comedian sets your brain up for a zig and then zags. For example, a priest, a rabbi, and a duck walk into a bar, etc. A trio of MIT researchers led by Matthew Hurley suggests the pleasure we get from these incongruities is the result of a small dopamine reward our brain gives up for finding an error in our assumptions. The incongruity theory explains why you might pause after you read a simple joke, like, a termite walks into a bar and asks, "Is the bartender here?" and find it a little funny. The second theory of humor is what Aristotle described as the superiority theory. The superiority theory describes humor as we experience when we suddenly feel better about ourselves. Typically, this comes at the expense of another and generally involves someone else's pain. Mel Brooks channeled Aristotle when he said, "Tragedy is when I cut my finger. Comedy is when you fall into an open sewer and die." Expressed mathematically, the superiority theory reads comedy equals pain plus distance. Finally, and most fundamentally, there is the relief theory. The American philosopher John Dewey defined the relief theory as the sudden relaxation of strain. This theory explains why we find humor in a scary or unsettling event that suddenly transitions to a safe one. For example, a Jack in the Box, a game of chase, or an anticlin. The relief theory works across species. Chimpanzees enjoy chasing each other as much as any human toddler, which suggests the laugh that occurs at the sudden transition from terror to safely likely originates in deep antiquity. Because humor often involves flipping one's expectations, and what one expects varies dramatically depending on time and culture, jokes reveal social structures. Who forms the butt of jokes, for example? Is it lawyers, barbarians, squires, or accountants? What about ethnicities, genders, or physical appearance? Thanks to the superiority theory, humor often kicks down at a society's most vulnerable. In cuneiform humor, enslaved people and women receive disproportionate amounts of derision. Jokes like this one passed on by Matushik, which is one of the oldest archaeologists have ever discovered, hint at a misogynistic attitude in Acadia. Her ever so pure womb is finished. It means financial loss for her house. The phrase ever so pure, according to Matusik, is one of the oldest uses of written sarcasm. These old jokes reveal still more about Akkadian social structure. According to Foster, low-ranking officials and businessmen were frequent targets, while royalty were not. Those who displayed cowardice, ambition, bad manners, lust, and conceit were also fair game. Yet, as Foster tells me, it's hard to identify downright obscene jokes in cuneiform when so little of ancient standards of decency are known. Violations of decency, including cursing, are a venerated tool of comics both ancient and modern. Cursing itself, the intentional violation of a cultural taboo, has likely always existed. However, it's difficult to say what Will Howard, after dropping a stone on his foot, thanks to the ephemeral nature of taboos. What one culture finds incredibly offensive, the next might find milquetoast. One of modern English's swear words, for example, or many of them, are related to bodily functions and sex. But as recently as medieval England, privacy was so rare that the English performed many bathroom functions in the open, and bathroom words lacked the cultural shock a swear word requires. Medieval kindergarten teachers might have mixed words like piss in with their daily lesson. Instead, when medieval intended to shock, they cursed God bones or God's blood. Would Will's obscene shouts have been of a religious nature, or ethnic, or bathroom related, or something else entirely? Scholars aren't sure. But as much as punchlines changed, the basic structure of humor in stories has varied little. In some cases, it hasn't at all. Take this 4,000-year-old Akkadian story that Foster proposes as one of the oldest humorous tales ever written. 9 wolves were holding 10 sheep. There was one extra, so they did not know how to divide their shares. A fox, having come upon them, said, "Let me divide your shares for you. You are 9, take 1. I am 1, let me take 9. That's the share I prefer." The fox in this joke fits a character archetype anthropologists call the trickster, one who breaks society's rules not as a vandal, but for their own personal gain. The trickster lures the folk stories of virtually every culture studied. In Native American tribes, it's a role often played by a coyote, in African cultures by a rabbit, and in Hollywood by Jim Carrey or Bugs Bunny. It's a stock character that the Homo sapiens brain seems to find timelessly funny and compelling. The endurance of humor, profanity, and the trickster archetype suggest every Homo sapiens culture has employed them, long before Will ever picked up a stylus. But he was the first to commit these jokes to a tablet, and in doing so, these lowbrow jokes and insults became some of the first non-accounting related remarks ever written. Will's process of teaching cuneiform, perhaps in interest of making it easier to learn, changed the medium itself. For centuries after Will, these written witticisms stayed within scribal schools, but as an increasing number of scribal teachers began writing these ancient Sumerian proverbs and didactic literatures, they developed a media of basic pictographs into one that could replicate every sound of language. At first, the written passages were simple one-liners, but as writing advanced, jokes and proverbs eventually became stories, myths, epic tales, songs, biographies, and medical treatises. With the small but not insignificant contribution of a creative Akkadian scribal schoolmaster like Will, written history itself was launched. Unfortunately, Will's tomb is probably lost forever. Thanks to his contribution, though, the hard evidence of his middling sense of humor is not and never will be. And that is the end of that chapter. If you enjoyed it, please check out the playlist with the rest of the chapters of this book. And like and subscribe. Thank you.